Welcome to the Peyton Randolph House. It is one of the most haunted houses on the eastern seaboard and was actually ranked by USA Today as one of the most haunted places in America. The Peyton Randolph House was built in 1715 and later purchased in 1721 by Sir John Randolph, the only colonial Virginian ever to receive knighthood. He then purchased the eastern lot in 1724. He passed it down to his son Peyton Randolph, who, as you can see, is the namesake of the Peyton Randolph House. Peyton Randolph, you would know, is the cousin of Thomas Jefferson and also the president of the First and Second Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War happens to be when the misfortune that follows this house first began. During the Revolution, the governor of Williamsburg at the time, Lord Dunmore, issued a decree that any slave whose master was rebelling against the crown could defect to the British side and be rewarded at the end of the war with freedom. So naturally, many slaves thought this was a sweet deal, and they took him up on that, and they defected to the British, including many of Randolph's slaves, very specifically his wife's personal slave, Eve. After the war, as we know, standing here in the United States of America, the British did not win. Therefore, these slaves, instead of being given freedom, were returned to their masters who were not happy with them. And Eve in particular was returned to the Randolphs, who abused and mistreated her for the rest of Mrs. Randolph's life. And then once Mrs. Randolph passed away, she was sold away and separated forever from her son. And that is where the haunting and misfortune begins for this house. In the years to come, many unfortunate happenings began. Two men were inside the house and got in a fight and both shot each other. Two children fell to their deaths, both years apart. A Civil War veteran also died in this house under very mysterious circumstances. The first written account of the hauntings of this house came from Marquis de Lafayette, who in 1824 was going through America to talk to veterans of the war. As he entered the Randolph house where he was staying, he claims that he was very excited and felt fortunate to be able to stay in the house of such a great man in Peyton Randolph. However, as he entered the foyer, he claims to have felt a hand on his shoulder. And it was nudging him as if it wanted him to leave. And he turned around and realized that there was nothing there. He says that his stay at the Randolph house was very restless and not very good for him, as when he slept, he heard voices throughout the night. Fast forward a little over a century later, in the 60s, the Peyton Randolph house was used as overflow housing for William and Mary. And so college students lived there, and one college student in particular, after a long day of studying, I'm sure, got back to his dorm for some well-earned rest. Once he was at his dorm, he laid down and started to drift off, and suddenly he felt something touching his arm. He was like, oh, it's gotta be nothing. But he quickly realized it was not nothing when his bed began shaking violently underneath him to the point that he got up and sprinted out of the room and did not return, not even to get his belongings. Our next story comes involving a security guard who was patrolling his grounds dutifully and ended up in the basement of the Randolph house. And as he entered the basement, he suddenly heard an otherworldly roar that got louder and louder, and he felt a force grab his ankles and pin him to the ground. So quickly he radioed for help, and 10 long minutes later, help arrived and the security guards showed up. They ripped the door, which had been wedged shut, open, and as soon as they opened the door, whatever force was pinning the guard down released. This is the story that they tell all of the security guards around here to let them know exactly what to expect from the Randolph house. Shortly after this, a woman was living in the eastern lot of the house, and she regularly called security because she heard the screaming of children on the other side of the house. She passed away in 2000, and the lot was vacated, and while the lot was vacated, there was one moment in particular where the fire alarm suddenly went off. The security guards ran to investigate, but they didn't even have keys to get into the house, so they had to bust through the window, and once they got in the window, they were like, all right, where's the fire? And they looked for the fire extinguisher, and they went to the wall where the fire extinguisher should be, and it was gone without a trace. So they searched and found in the middle of a room in the house with the fire extinguisher spray all over the place around it, sitting perfectly was the fire extinguisher. They could not even find the pin, and there was not a single trace of anyone who entered the house. There was not a single footprint anywhere to be seen. So all of this begs the question, why on earth is this house so haunted? We asked that ourselves, and we did some digging. And we found out that two archaeologists in the 1930s, commissioned by Colonial Williamsburg, they did some digging and found out that two Native Americans were buried underneath the house. They dug a little deeper and found all kinds of Native American pottery. And when you look at the basements of these houses, they're dug so deeply into the ground that it's possible that they disrupted all kinds of Native American graves. When we asked a lot of the owners of these houses, they knew that it was built on Native American bodies and Native American artifacts. And they, in fact, demanded that those artifacts be theirs, right? And they were told, all right, whatever you find is yours. Therefore, all of this led to us believing that this is probably the best theory as to why this house is so haunted. On one tour in particular from our company, we had EMF detectors to detect supernatural entities. And so we brought them up to this house, and just like I'm doing right now, the tour guide was telling the story of the history of the house, and they all of a sudden realized that the detectors went from fully charged to completely dead in an instant. In that same instant, the phones of many in the group instantly died. And at that same instant, the most horrifying of all, the temperature around all of them went from very uncomfortably warm to frigid. It dropped about 20 degrees in one instant. As we go through these houses, we use our spirit boxes to communicate with the spirits here. And whenever we come here to the Randolph house, we communicate with the spirits, and they all have the same message for us. Please leave. Some of them are very polite about it. Some are much more colorful in the way that they say it. We have even had tour guides that have been cussed out by the spirits here at the Randolph house.